I need you to look at something. This is a human skull that was cut carefully into a bowl. It came out of a ditch in Germany. There was no war or battle. It was a 7,000-year-old human workshop. It was something no one had ever seen before and something nobody would ever build again. And the story behind this is stranger and more disturbing than anyone expected. My name's Joe and this is one Buried Earth video that is well worth your time. So, the ditch was in a place called Herxheimer, a small village in southwestern Germany. The bones were found here in 1996 during a rescue excavation, and what came out of the ground has never been matched anywhere in European archaeology. 76,000 individual bone fragments, representing at least 500 people, men, women and children, all ages from infants up to older adults, and only about half of the enclosure has been excavated. The bones weren't laid out in graves, whole bodies did not go into that ditch, pieces of bodies did. Nearly every single bone recovered from the fill shows cut marks, skulls, ribs, vertebrae and long bones, but the joint surfaces show that certain clean cuts were made when the bones were separated. The cut marks were made with stone tools, small blades drawn cleanly across the bone in controlled motions, deep enough to cut the surface, not deep enough to break it. The long bones were split lengthways along the marrow cavity, deliberately opening up the bones. The skulls were carefully worked on as well. The scalp cut away first, then the face and the base of the skull were removed. What was left was shaped bone bowls. Somebody was making them. Some bones show heat damage consistent with cooking. Some show cut marks consistent with human teeth. Whatever was done to the people in this ditch was done to hundreds of them, systematically, in what appears to have been a very short period of time. And it wasn't done by strangers of the village. Before we get into the story of how any of this happened, here's what makes Herxheimer more than just a gruesome archaeological site. There's 5 things about what was found in that ditch that scholars are still trying to work out. Number 1, the people whose bones ended up in the ditch weren't from Herxheimer. Most of them had grown up somewhere else. Some had grown up hundreds of kilometers away. Number 2, the whole thing happened the exact same time that Europe's first civilization was falling apart. Herxheimer wasn't an isolated horror. It was one of the last things that the whole culture ever did. Number 3, 3 other villages in the same region were being wiped out as acts of mass violence around the same time period, but none of them look anything like Herxheimer. Number 4, 2 archaeologists have been publicly arguing about what actually happened in that ditch for 16 years. Neither one of them have won the argument. The debate is still active to this year. Number 5, only about half of the enclosure has ever been excavated. The rest of the story is still in the ground. We're going to work through all of it, but first, we need to look at the moment the bones actually came out of the ground. So, 1996, the town of Herxheimer wanted to expand a small industrial area on its western edge. Under German law, before major construction can happen on ground that might hold archaeology, a rescue excavation must happen. The dig was led by an archaeologist named Annemarie Häuser. Her team already knew that there was Neolithic settlement under the ground there. That had been established decades earlier from surface finds. But what they didn't know was what else was underneath the settlement. The first bones came up in the summer of 1996. At first, the team assumed a cemetery. Bones next to a Neolithic village site is not unexpected. But the bones weren't cemetery bones. They weren't articulated. They weren't laid out in graves. They were fragmented and mixed together, packed into a fill of a ceremonial ditch that ran around the settlement. The rescue excavation continued from 1996 to 1999. By the end of it, their team had identified hundreds of individuals from the recovered material. The scale was already unprecedented. The site was too important to be handed back to the developer. A second, more careful research excavation was opened in 2005. This one was led by Andrea Zieblans of the State Cultural Heritage Office. Zeeblans built an international team around the material as the site was getting a lot of attention. A German archaeologist named Fabian Hack was brought in to study the architecture of the ditch itself, and French anthropologist Bruno Boulestin to lead the analysis of the human remains. The research excavation ran from 2005 to 2008. By the end of it, they had approximately 76,000 pieces of human bone in the lab from more than 500 individuals. 1 year after the excavation ended, in 2009, Boulestin's team published a paper. The paper was titled Mass Cannibalism in the Linear Pottery Culture of Herxheimer. That title was not accidental. He was making that claim directly, and he was making it in one of the highest profile archaeological journals in the world. The paper landed like a rock in a pond. Some archaeologists agreed with it, others did not. Zeeblans herself, the lead excavator of the site, didn't fully agree with the man that she had brought in to study the bones. The scientific fight over what really happened started with that 2009 paper, and it hasn't ended. To understand why it hasn't ended, you have to understand the world Herxheimer came from. The people who built the village of Herxheimer were part of a civilization, not a small tribe, stretching all the way from modern-day Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, even parts of France, all connected, all sharing the same house styles and pottery, and the same way of farming the land. Archaeologists call them the Linear Pottery Culture, in German the Linear Band Keramik, or just the LBK for this video. They arrived in Europe as farmers at around 5500 BCE, quickly populating the entire area through farming the continent, which had been sparsely populated by hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. But what made them different was what they brought with them: seed grain, cattle, sheep, pigs, a whole new way of living on this land. Their villages had been between 5 and 20 longhouses, big timber-framed buildings, sometimes 40 meters long, the size of a modern-day warehouse, divided into stalls for animals, storage of grain, and living space for the extended families. Their fields grew wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. Cattle grazed the cleared pastures around the villages. Dogs slept at the edge of the fires, and pigs foraged in the woods. They also had very distinctive pottery that gave their culture its name, and they were connected to the wider world. Obsidian tools found in the LBK villages had been traced to sources of Hungary and Slovakia, hundreds of kilometers from where they ended up. Spondylus shells, which is a Mediterranean seashell, has also been found in their graves as ornaments, brought thousands and thousands of kilometers inland to be placed in their graves. These were people who traded across the entire continent. The LBK lasted for about 500 years. For most of that time, everything had held together completely fine. Villages grew, fields expanded, and life was ordered. Herxheimer was a part of all of this. The village had been occupied since around 5300 BCE, for at least 300 years before the bones went into that ditch. People had been born there, they had married, they had farmed there, they had buried their dead in the ordinary LBK way, in small graves next to their houses. For 500 years, this was a normal way of life across a huge population of Europe. And then, around 5100 BCE, something started to change. The first signs of what was coming showed up in the ground around the villages of the LBK before they showed up in the villages themselves. Herxheimer wasn't the only late LBK village where mass violence appeared. It was the strangest one, but it wasn't the only one. 3 other sites give us a wider picture. Thalheim. In 1983, in a vineyard in southern Germany, a farmer digging a wine cellar hit human bones. When archaeologists came in, they recovered 34 people from a single pit: men, women, and children. The whole small community killed on a single day, killed with the same polished stones that they had used to clear the fields. Some also shot with arrows. The bodies were thrown into the pit without ceremony or individual graves. Thalheim was the village that had been attacked and destroyed in one afternoon. Schletz, that had been discovered in Austria that same year, was a fortified village ringed with a defensive ditch. The ditch didn't save them. Excavators have so far recovered 67 bodies from the ditch itself. The total estimation is much higher, possibly even hundreds. The dead were killed with clubs and axes. Some show execution-style wounds, struck from behind when kneeling. Their bodies were left where they fell. The bones showed gnaw marks from wolves and bones that had been at them before they were finally buried. And the demographic profile is missing something. The young women were underrepresented in the recovered bodies, which almost certainly means that they were taken alive. Kilianstetten, discovered in central Germany in 2006, had 26 people killed with arrows and blunt force weapons. Nothing unusual about that alone in this period, but many of the dead had their lower legs deliberately shattered after they were killed, not from combat. This was done afterwards with heavy weapons swung with force. The team who published the site interpreted it as either a ritual act or a psychological message, something meant to be seen by whoever came looking for the missing people. Taking all of those sites together, late LBK Europe was not peaceful. Villages were being destroyed by other villages. Communities were killing each other with the tools that they used to farm. And in the middle of all of this violence on the western edge of the LBK world, one village did something that none of the others did. They didn't kill their enemies and dump them. They took people apart. Fabian Hack's work on the architecture of the site answered one question that everyone asked about Herxheimer. Was it a fort? And it wasn't. The ditch at Herxheimer wasn't a continuous defensive circuit. It was made from individual long pits, dug in sequence and joined up so that from the air it looked like a continuous ring, but from the ground there were gaps in it, openings that you could walk straight through. The eastern side may have been open altogether, and the pits were rapidly backfilled. They weren't left open as standing defences, they were dug and then filled again in a very short period. What Herxheimer actually was, based on the architecture and the deliberate deposits inside the pits, it was a ritual enclosure, a sacred space marked around the village, similar to other Neolithic ritual sites known elsewhere in Europe, though none of the others were used in the way Herxheimer's was used. Inside the enclosed space, there was a normal LBK settlement, longhouses, families, cattle, ordinary Neolithic life going on. But what was being marked out of the ditch wasn't defensive lines, it was a boundary between the ordinary world and something else. The village had been occupied for centuries. The earliest LBK settlement in Herxheimer dates to around 5300 BCE, but the deposits in that ditch, the bones and the deliberately broken pottery along with smashed stone tools all happened in a very short window, right at the end of the village's occupation. The best current estimates for the depositional phase was about 50 years, possibly less. Everything horrifying about Herxheimer happened in the last few decades of the village's existence, and the village did not survive it. So now we go back to the bones, because after 12 years of analysis, we know a lot more now than what was happening in that ditch than we did in 1996. The 76,000 bone fragments represent one of the most intensely studified assemblages of human remains ever recorded in the European prehistoric site. The pattern of processing is what makes Herxheimer so unique. Bullestan's analysis showed that the cut mark patterns on the Herxheimer bones match the patterns of cut marks used to butcher animals at contemporary LBK sites. The same techniques used to prepare ox or sheep were being used on human bodies. There was a specific order. The head was processed first, the scalp was cut away, leaving fine cut marks visible on the top of the skull. Then the face and the base of the skull were removed. What was left was calots, the top vault of the skull shaped into a bowl. The calots of Herxheimer were accidents of processing. They were not the point of it. Somebody was making them deliberately from the top of every single skull. The limbs came next, cut at the joints, then the hands and feet cut off at the wrists and ankles. Then the long bones were split, not broken, split along the length, along the marrow cavity. The splitting pattern matches the splitting pattern used on animal bones of the same period to extract marrow. Marrow is calorie dense. Prehistoric people took marrow out of animal bones by splitting them the exact same way down the long bones as Herxheimer's were split. Some of the bones show heat damage as well, burning patterns consistent with cooking focusing on the flesh-bearing surfaces. Some show marks that have been interpreted as human teeth marks. The processing pattern was applied consistently across everybody found in the ditch: adults, teenagers, younger children, and infants, all processed in the exact same way. One of the individuals identified from the assemblage was a child of about 6 years old, whose age was determined by tooth development. The cut marks on their bones follow the same procedure as those done on the adults. This wasn't rage, it wasn't a raid gone bad, and it wasn't absolute chaos. It was a procedure. Somebody had taught somebody else how to do it, and it was done in the same way every single time using the same tools. And the people that it was being done to weren't even from Herxheimer. The evidence for this is strontium. Strontium is a chemical element that gets into human teeth enamel during childhood. On many of our videos over the past few weeks on Buried Earth, we've actually talked about this process quite a bit. It comes from the food and water a person consumes while their teeth are forming, and it locks into the enamel with a signature that only matches that geological location of where that person grew up. Different regions have different signatures. What Herxheimer would have is completely different to what other parts of Europe would have. A scientist named Reuven Turk ran isotope analysis on the first molars of 83 individuals from the Herxheimer assemblage. About 90% of them had strontium signatures that did not match the ground around Herxheimer. The signature matched higher granitic uplands, not where Herxheimer was. These people had not grown up in the local area, many of them probably not even in the broader region. And here is where it's going to get a little bit strange for this video. Ancient DNA work carried out at the same skeletal material by a team led by Jens Blocher at the University of Mainz found that the sampled individuals fit within the known genetic range of Linear Pottery Culture populations. The victims of Herxheimer were not foreigners in the ethnic sense. They were LBK people, but they weren't just LBK people from Herxheimer. Whoever was going into that ditch had been brought there elsewhere from the LBK world. The pottery in the ditch confirms it. The deliberately broken pots deposited alongside the bones come from at least 8 different LBK-style regions. Some of the pottery in the ditch was made 400 kilometers away from Herxheimer in what is now the Czech Republic. People were coming to Herxheimer from all across the LBK world. So was pottery, and so were tools, both getting systematically destroyed and buried in the same ceremonial ditch. Herxheimer wasn't just local horror, it was a regional ritual centre, pulling in people and objects from all across Europe's first civilization, and during its brief active life, whatever it did to those people and objects, it did the same way every single time. Which now brings us back to that fight that started in 2009. Bullerstein's paper argued the simplest reading of the bones: if the cut marks match animal butchery, if the long bones were split for marrow, if some of the bones show cooking, and if some of them show teeth marks, the simplest explanation is that people at Herxheimer were being eaten. Andrea Zieblans, the archaeologist who led the excavation and knows the site better than anybody, disagreed. Not with the physical observations. Bullerstein is a very good anthropologist and his descriptions of the bones are widely accepted. Zieblans disagreed with the conclusion though. Her position is that if you cannot prove ingestion from the bones alone, you cannot prove the processing and pattern, you cannot prove the last step, that they were eaten. Zieblans has published her own interpretation in a series of papers and in a major synthesis volume in 2019 called Ritualized Destruction in the Early Neolithic. Her framework is that Herxheimer was a system of ritual destruction. Bodies were destroyed, pottery and tools as well. Everything went into the ditch broken. Whatever was happening there was the deliberate unmarking of valuable things, including people, as part of a religious practice that we can't currently reconstruct or understand. Bullerstein and Zieblans have been publishing back and forths arguing with this for 16 years. As recently as this year, Bullerstein even gave a long interview to Le Monde, restating his cannibalism argument. Zieblan continues to hold her position. Neither of them have won, completely splitting the scientific community. But what both sides do agree on is a little bit more disturbing than either interpretation alone is. Herxheimer wasn't warfare or a raid or a fight. What happened there was structured and specific. Whoever was doing it knew what they were doing. Whoever was bringing them to the people who was doing it to them was working in a network that reached all across of European civilization. The last thing everyone agrees on though is when it happened. Herxheimer happened at the very end. It was the end of the village and the enclosure, and roughly the end of the LBK. Across Central Europe, between 5000 and 4900 BCE, the linear pottery culture came apart. Villages were abandoned, longhouses were left standing until they rotted, the pottery styles stopped, cemetery use ended, and in some regions, occupation just stopped altogether. It was Europe's first ever collapse of an entire civilization, and archaeology hasn't fully explained it yet. The theories? Climate. Around 5000 BCE, Europe went through colder, drier conditions. Disease. New pathogens moving through connected farming populations was a big deal. There was also warfare. The sites at Telheim, Schlitz and Kilistan show what that looked like. Ideological collapse. Sometimes belief systems fail before economies do. Probably some combination is closer to the truth than any one of them completely alone. But what Herxheimer does show us is what one part of the LBK world did as it fell apart. They dug a ceremonial enclosure and pulled people in from hundreds of kilometers away. They processed them systematically in the sacred place, and then when it was all over, they just left. Whether Herxheimer was the symptom of a collapse or the contribution to it is the question that evidence can't really answer, but both are possible. About half of the enclosure at Herxheimer is still under the ground. Nobody has excavated it. Nobody has counted the people still down there. The current projection, based on the density of the remains in its excavated half, is more than 1,000 individuals across the entire site. Some of them have been in the dirt for 7,000 years. They will still be there this time next year and the year after. We can still see the procedure. We can still see the marks that the tools left on their bones. But what we can't see is what they thought they were doing, or whether the people that were doing it had any idea what was coming. And that's it from me, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video on Buried Earth. My name's Joe. On screen right now, 2 more videos I think you're gonna absolutely love.